So again, we start at 4 past. You already have the link to the minutes in the chat. Please help out taking notes, though Krista and I will mostly take care of those. Hi, Richard. And hi, Esko.
So we were wondering whether there should be waiting music while waiting for a meeting to start. And I think that hearing the occasional mouse click is very reassuring and completely replaces the need for waiting music.
We can
I
sample
can
it and
unmute while
have
I'm
it as
typing.
we can sample these things and have those as an actual waiting soundtrack.
Pretty traditional that the audience sings the Jeopardy music while waiting.
Whatever, I really want Christian keyboard involved. Okay, let's give 1 more minute, then we'll start.
I think you can start doing the jazz slides.
Shall we?
Yeah.
All right then, let's start. Welcome everyone to this interim meeting of the working group, last before IETF-117. I am Marco Tilocca, Michael Cesar, Jaime Jimenez, and Karsten Bormann. And as usual, the not well applies. We've been recorded, and reveal your IPRs if you have any. It's not just about that, it's also and especially about our code of conduct, so be nice and professional to each other. We have a pretty packed agenda today, especially compared to past interim meetings. As recording for a while now, we have an entry for CoreConf, for the core seed and COMI document. Then we couldn't make it 2 weeks ago, so it comes today, a discussion on attacks on co-op, input from Christian and John. Martina will give an update pre-IETF-117 on the NSOver co-op, and time allowing, but I think so, we can also have a discussion that was also originally planned for 2 weeks ago on non-traditional responses, input mostly from Karsten and Christian. And then let's try to save a few minutes for the end just for a quick announcement on next core events in the coming weeks and months. Any agenda bashing or more input for today? Heard none. We can start with CoreConf. Karsten.
Okay. Yeah, so I have some 11 slides, but I'll do this quickly, and the first few slides are just repeats anyway. So just in case you're wondering where we are, we have 4 core documents in the working group. The first one is RFC, defining the encoding. The second one defines how exactly to do the SID allocation for that encoding to be efficient. The third one maps Yang to CoAP using the Yang CBOR encoding. And the fourth one, which is not on the list today, is the Yang library, or concise form of the Yang library. So we are still working on revising SID 20, which was pushed back to the working group so we can complete some work on this. And it turns out this actually was necessary. We added global file status and per SID status to make the SID documents be more indicative of what they actually are. And right now we are trying to complete this work, but we would need a version of Pyang that actually can be used for generating our examples. And it turns out that's a slightly bigger construction site than we thought. So there are a number of forks of Pyang. The mainline version doesn't actually generate the examples that we are using. So there apparently was some manual editing. And of course, that's not really a tenable situation, in particular, since we don't really have any validation mechanism either. So one way of being sure that what you have is structurally sound is to generate it. The other one is to validate it. But if you don't have either, that's a problem, and that causes us to find more and more issues each time. So the one thing, after we have cleaned up Yang, the one thing we actually need to do is make sure that we have SIDs for the remaining identifiers that we identified need to have SIDs. And that is probably just a small matter of programming, but the consolidation in front of it is kind of dwarfing this effort. There are also some small editorial items that need to be done, which I didn't focus on yet. So yeah, validation is one of the bigger open items that maybe we can look for some ideas how to do this. So the set of issues that we need to work on, one thing that already is fixed is that the RPC parameter SIDs actually need input and output in the strings, in the identifier string. So that's actually fixed now. The Pyang implementation doesn't generate a dependency revision section. This is completely missing. I don't know what needs to be done to get this, or if it's not really implemented at all. Then we have some spurious plurals. So there are things like items and assignment ranges being generated, but the Yang name is item and assignment range. That's a perennial problem, singular, plural. And then I don't think that the Pyang implementation reflects SX structure. So we are missing an embedding in the SX structure name IETF SID file colon SID file. And finally, all the SIDs generated are numbers, but they need to be strings because they can be uint64. So that's just a small summary of what needs to be fixed on the Pyang side. So what I think we will do now is continue with the Pyang work. So next step will be to get the Laurent's patches in there, and then maybe the patches from his grad students. Yeah, we are obviously not going to have this completed early enough to have the discussion this week. So it seems like we will have to wait a little bit longer before we can submit and do the working group plus call, but I hope we can still do this in such a way that we can discuss it at 1:17. So work is remaining. There isn't a dependency slowing us down, but we have control, a limited amount of control over that dependency. So I'm not really worried here. It's just a delay. The other document is the COMI document, which tells us how to map CoreConf on CoAP. So just like RESTConf was a mapping for HTTP, CoreConf is doing that for CoAP and doing it for CBOR as well. So it plays both the role of 7951 for JSON and 8040 for HTTP in one document, minus the parts that are already done in 9254. So we went through working plus call a while ago. Then we decided we wanted to have some simplifications, and we completed these simplifications. They are in -13. But there is one remaining issue that I want to briefly talk about today, which is the way we use post. And that's a bit surprising because the simplifications brought new focus on the way to use fetch and IPatch. But yeah, we apparently didn't look at post as much in that process, and we probably need to. So what we need to do apart from the posting is the media types that we define actually are not CBOR media types, they are CBOR sequence media types. So we have to change the media type names. That was easy, so it's already done in the editor's copy. And we have an example in there that is under a headline RPC example, but it's actually not an RPC example, it's an action example. So we have to rename that, which is also done in the editor's copy, and add an actual RPC example probably, because you want to make sure that people who want to do RPCs understand how to do that. Now the question that came up when juggling these examples was, does this actually work, and is it actually concise? And let me show you what's in the current document in -13. So this says we are posting to the data store resource, an example name of which would be /c. And we are posting a Yang instances CBOR sequence, but in this case, it's actually just one element. So it's actually, if there were Yang instances CBOR, this would also qualify. But when you then actually look at the example, we see a CBOR sequence of 2 items, the identifier and Yang data map. And that's definitely wrong, because we are supposed to have Yang instances, which are instance identifiers as map keys going to a map that is a Yang data object. So this is definitely wrong, but it's pretty obvious how to fix this. But when you actually look at this, there's also something quite striking. Why are we repeating the SID for the actual RPC or action that we are talking to? And we already have identified that probably as a mistake, and have made one slide that summarizes all that, based on an example from the RESTConf RFC 8040. We probably should be using that example so people who know RESTConf can find their way. So what we see here on the left side is the RPC request, and in the second, further down, an action request. And essentially the difference between an RPC and an action request is that an action request identifies a specific place in the data tree that the RPC is applied to. So it's kind of a method invocation, while RPCs are just generally going to the server. And we probably don't need to separate these. This is really just, do we have any additional parameters like the ETH0, I'm sorry, for the interface ID in the action example. We don't have that in an RPC because we are not identifying a place in the data tree. So we have to give the name of the RPC or action, which we can do with a SID, in this case the reboot SID for the reboot RPC, and the interface reset SID for the interface reset action. And then something weird happens in 8040. There is a interstitial here, which is the SID of the input part of that RPC or action. And it's not at all clear why that is needed. So the reboot SID would be the 60,002 from the previous slide. The input SID would be 60,004 or something, depending on what SID it actually gets. And then in that, we would get the various parameters like delay, message, language for the message, and so on. Looking at that, I'm essentially forced to propose getting rid of this input SID thing, because it's very clear a request will have an input SID and a response will have the output SID. It cannot be any different from that. So why are we sending this? This is not at all clear. And the routing in the Yang SID space is already done by the operation name, by the RPC name or action name, like reboot and interface reset. So there really is no point putting that SID in there. So this is a proposal I'm making to further simplify RPCs and actions. I'm not sure that anybody actually has implemented these things. I'm still looking for an implementer that we could talk to find out whether that creates any problems. But in the end, this just means there's one less actually completely redundant SID implementations have to remember what it is and have to check. And we are saving a couple of bytes, maybe 3 or so. Okay, so this is a technical change that we have generated by actually examining this, and we are currently discussing this between the authors and a few implementers, and hope to have something for the list to send to the list this week. So based on that, yeah, we are also late with this timeline. We definitely want to use the progress from the SID work in this draft as well. So we want to generate the SID file that applies to this draft using Pyang and not by hand. We want to use any validation progress we are making. We want to fix the to-dos on the previous slide and make the post-format decision I just outlined, and then we can do a working progress call. And again, yeah, before or after 117, but we definitely want to discuss this at 117. So that's where we are with these two documents. And then, of course, we want to finish the Yang library and get to the item that is frequently requested, which is not only having efficient encoding of the structure of a Yang data item, but also to get binary formats for things like IP addresses, dates, and so on that tend to be very bloaty when all the structure around that is so concise with Yang SIBO. Any questions? Okay.
Yeah, Karsten, on Coma, you may want to bring also Michael Richardson up to
Yes,
speed
yes,
on
yes,
Shepard.
yes.
Yeah, just because he
Yes.
hasn't participated in the very recent discussions, as far as I could see. At the interim
Well,
meeting.
I had him added to the off-list discussion. So
Okay,
yes.
thank you. Okay, then looking forward to the next steps in the discussion, San Francisco or online. If there's no comments or questions on this.
Well, there is one comment from Esco on the chat, which I will take care of.
Oh yeah, correct. Good catch. Okay, then we can move to the next one. I think John will present.
Are you going to bring the slides up, or do you want me to do that?
As you wish. Can you? Otherwise, we can and give you control. It's just the same.
Yeah.
I think Karsten is doing that.
Okay, so essentially this comes out of some discussions that have been on the net, and just really trying to highlight some of them, some of my thinking. I accept my thinking is never 100% pure. There's always a flaw in it, but just to bring this up and get us thinking a bit about this. So if you can go to the next slide.
Control. You have control, just press the right arrow.
Right arrow. Okay, yep. Thank you. Okay, so just there's some block 2 responses, questions and thinkings, token manipulation, and some clarifications which I think a lot of people keep stumbling into as to what actually we're supposed to be doing under these circumstances. Okay, so just taking a standard block 2 response without using request tag or e-tag, I've got it documented there, but all that's happening here is the requests are being reordered as they come in by the foe. This really is dependent on whether the server does kind of a LIFO or FIFO kind of response when he's doing his lookup, and so the attacker can change his method depending on whether he detects the server is the FIFO or the LIFO method, whatever. But essentially what's happening here is that we have the 2 requests for initial bits of data in concurrent, and then there's a request for the next block of data. But the server has no knowledge of whether that is against the first request, T1, or against the second request, T2, makes a decision, sends a response back, but could be sending the wrong data back. And at that point, the client, as far as he's concerned, he's received data, he appends it to whatever and deals with it, but the data is corrupted. That's when we're not using request or e-tag. We can be using e-tags to determine whether the data coming back is part of the first request or part of the second request. But the challenge here is that the server may elect to send the next block of data against a request that has not yet come in. So the client, when receiving it, he sees that the e-tag is not quite what he expects. What is he supposed to do with that response? So he will be expecting an e-tag of 12 to come back if he got back the right data he's asking for, but it comes back with an e-tag of 11, giving a block that he hasn't yet asked for. So just using e-tag only creates problems on block 2 responses. If we go and use request tag, which I think was a wonderful invention, then it's very simple for the server to realize or work out which request has come in against and therefore send back the appropriate response back to the client. But the only comment really on this is if we do request tag only, because e-tag is not being used, we can't detect, or the client cannot detect, that the data has somehow changed on the server since the previous request. You can't see that it's changed because e-tag is not getting updated. So, given that request tag always gives us the right block coming back, but the challenge is that the client has no knowledge of whether the response is going to come back as a block 2 or just as a single response. So should we be sending request tag with every request, which is supported in RFC 9175, or should we be doing something different? It creates an unnecessary overhead. Yes, it can be small, a few bytes, But if we're talking about DTLS, it needs to be larger to kind of make it more unpredictable in terms of trying to analyze what's going on. It is actually required in the RFC 9177Q block logic that the request tag is there with every request. But the challenge, if we don't use request tag, if multiple requests are active, the server can select the wrong response. We have a problem there. So, and how to mitigate this? We can send a request tag with every request. We can stop the client doing concurrent different requests against the same resource but with different parameters, but we cannot control the end start equals 1 because there are multiple blocks to be returned. Maybe that we need to think about perhaps a new signal from the server in the response that says, you haven't given me a request tag, but you're going to need this, in quotes, request tag to ask for the subsequent blocks of the same block, same sort of payload of data. But how can that be done? At the moment, request tag is not allowed to be in a response. Should we be allowing that in a response, overriding some of RFC 9175, or do we need to be thinking about a new block 2 option that has some sort of embedded request tag as generated by the server for the client to use to get to these subsequent blocks? And so that sort of is questions that sort of like to pose. I don't have any real answers to that, but I don't know what people think about that. Is there any kind of feedback at this point on that?
I'd like to say something here, but I'd like to let others go first here.
Yeah, I was wondering whether we could use echo for this.
Using echo here, I think would practically mean that the request has to be sent once more.
Yeah, that's I'm wondering about.
Okay.
There is no way for the server to detect whether the client is using the absent request tag intentionally, like it is you doing the request tag mechanism and determined that it doesn't need a request tag, or whether the client just is not using a request tag at all. In which case the echo might not be doing too much either. So I think the best approach here, personally, I think that not sending the payload in the requests where there is no block 1 fragmentation, but a request payload was a mistake. And I thought it went differently, and only after John brought this up, I found this, and consequently 9175 is incorrect here because it is built on my wrong assumption that the request payload is not sent. That the request payload is sent again.
Yeah.
Now that it is not sent again, I think that the good mitigation here would be just to send the request tag with every request that has request payload and may have response payload, but to make ample use of all the provisions that are in there that allow the request tag to be absent in most of the cases as long as you're not using DTLS.
Yeah, it's difficult to try and mandate something or encourage people to do something. Okay, yeah, so OS Core can help a bit here. Other people want to use DTLS for various reasons. Back in my old DOTS days, everything was DTLS, but it's not straightforward. But it just is, the server somehow signaling that it needs to do something. I guess if the client gets back a block response, he then can determine, oops, I should have done a request tag, and then go back and re-ask the request again, but using the request tag. So the cache key gets updated on the server.
The thing is, the operation, your examples do use post, so the operation actually does get performed a second time.
Yeah, okay, but if you use fetch, it's slightly different.
Yeah. For fetch, all is straightforward. And on users of DTLS already had to start sending a bit more data with the 9175 mandate of not reusing tokens. So essentially, and there is not too large. I mean, there is only this only affects requests where there is both a request payload and a response payload. And then sending a request tag for every such request, I think, is not too much of overhead in situ for DTLS users. I mean, they would just be incrementing a number there, and that would be like 2 to 3 bytes. 3 bytes in the.
You only need a request tag if you plan to have multiple requests outstanding. I mean, not in the end start sense, but in the sense of having multiple blockwise activities going on at the same time.
No.
Okay, it's okay, but the challenge is that if you then a client you could control, but a proxy may be asking multiple requests on behalf of multiple clients.
A proxy is not covered by DTLS. A proxy is kind of acting independently. A proxy has to know all these things anyway.
So since a proxy cannot guarantee that it only has one outstanding blockwise request, it will always have to send a request tag.
The thing is, it doesn't help to not have outstanding requests, because you might be injected an earlier request might be injected again into the stream. So that could be a retransmission of a message that was black holed earlier. So even if you are not doing any concurrent requests, you could still fall victim to that attack.
Correct.
Okay, I don't know that we need necessarily a definitive response now, but I think it's something certainly that needs to go into the draft RFC.
Into which draft?
Well, the CORE attacks draft. Sorry.
Yeah. Thing is, we not only, yes, it does need to go in there, but we also need to think about where do we fix it.
Sure. I know I've certainly fixed it at my end by sending a request tag every time, apart from a delete.
I mean, it only needs to be sent if there is a request payload and the method, and the method is not delete.
Yeah.
So they would also make the draft standard struct, right?
Say again, please.
They would make the draft standard struct.
I don't think we would fix it in co-op attacks, because co-op attacks was split out from
attacks using co-op.
No, it was also split out from echo request tag and token processing to have the normative stuff in there and then the motivation in a separate document. So the direction I'm thinking is a very short, small document that updates 9175 and says that this not only applies to requests, everything that was said about request tag and when you should use it, not only applies to requests with a fragmented with a block 1 fragmented request body, but also to requests that have a body and the recipient cannot be sure that the response will not be fragmented.
Yeah, that would work, I think.
Yeah, we certainly have in that 9175 the ability to be able to send a request tag without block 1, which was a last-minute change.
Yeah, and I think that was an artifact of proxies handling it right.
Could have been. I certainly ran into it with a client of mine who had this issue and just couldn't get the right data back.
Yeah, it was definitely a good thing to have it changed there.
Yep.
And it might be that in the review process, I missed the point where you already brought up that, or just applied my wrong understanding of blockwise transfer to it. Sorry for that.
That's fine. I think I also may have partially confused you. Looking back at an email trail about 2 years ago, I gave you an answer what I thought was the right answer to your question, but rereading your question, you were asking a slightly different question. So I may have sown the confusion there as well.
Anyhow, I think now we're in a position to fix it.
Yep.
So my impression is that every additional signaling that we would introduce would not be any slimmer than adding the request tag to that particular class of RPC style request.
Other than if the server with its generated request tag added it to the block 2 response, because he knew that there wasn't a request tag requesting it.
Thing is that could also happen on proxies, and then things do get a bit complicated.
Okay.
So I'm thinking of a case where a client is sending a fetch request, server is sending a big, say 1 kilobyte response, and then the proxy says, hey, I'm on a 6 kilobyte link, I'm gonna fragment the response, and then suddenly, like, I think this makes things more complicated than but it's an option to have another look at, but I think it's more complicated.
Okay, fair enough. Certainly a simple set of words as a guidance is a good way forward, which is use request tag unless you really don't want to. Okay, shall I move on or?
Please, yes.
Yep. Okay, so just comment on the attacks is that without the request tag, we've talked about that, and without the E tag, it's possible that data can get corrupted from the client's perspective. Without the E tag is because the server gives you half of a wodge of data, which is then updated mid-flight to something new, and the E tag doesn't change because it's not been given there. And just as another comment, n start equals 1 serialization can be broken by the man in the middle foe causing trouble, and it comes out actually better in a couple of slides just further on. Okay, so token manipulation is something else that sort of came out of the woodwork of this. Essentially here is that the client thinks he's doing a request to request 1 with using token 1 and request to request 2 using token 2. The foe changes the token so that the server sees the request 2 with token 1 and so on, and request 1 with token 2, and responds accordingly. And as far as the client's concerned, when he matches up token 1, he gets the response 2 data instead of the response 1 data. So it's just general manipulation of some guy sitting there in the middle. And the same thing can be done with con, but here is that the foe in the middle is getting a bit smarter, and so he's getting around the n start equals 1 issues by acking back the con request. So as far as the client is concerned, everything is it's not a piggybacked response at this time. It's going to get a subsequent response coming back. He then replaces the tokens moving upstream. The response comes back, which is now ACK, and again the foe changes it. Well, this because it's a delayed response, we need to send it back as a con, and then drops the responding ACK. So again, just even with cons, it's relatively easy for a foe to do token manipulation and get around the n start equals 1 kind of block, which most people will be challenged by. So it's kind of the attack that comes out of this works with none, or if con n starts greater than 1, which is to me got a whole load of other headaches if you go down that route. And then again, con if the switching the acts and cons. OS Core does protect this as an end-to-end because it doesn't care about tokens being changed as it passes through proxies and what have you, because the request response is properly matched. But DTLS doesn't do any protection there if the foe is some sort of rogue proxy, or he's done some successful man-in-the-middle interception of the DTLS session. So there's 2 completely separate DTLS sessions, one back to the client and one up to the server. And so again, as someone commented earlier, is mitigation against that kind of stuff is to use OS Core, and certainly do not use NoSec against that type of attack. But it is a different type of attack that's out there. I don't think there's much else that needs to be said about that, but I think that sort of thing should be in the co-op attacks document. And some clarifications, which is part of where Christian and I think I probably initially stumbled back in time, is if a request using block 1 triggers a block 2 response, the request for the next block as per 7959 is that leave out the block 1 options, which implicitly says don't give me any data, including that, and just use the block 2 request for the next block that you want coming back. So essentially is that there is no data that passes through on the request for the subsequent block coming back from the server, and the same is true if observe is being used as far as that is concerned. An observe request using block 1, and then somewhere subsequently the client decides to deregister it, it has to send the entire original data, is my understanding, including all the block 1s, as I read 7641 3.6. But a cancellation may trigger a block 2 set of responses. And what still is currently unclear in my mind is, should the client wait for all the, or go off and get all the block 2 responses to complete the deregister process so that the server can completely do stuff, or is just the first block coming back sufficient to acknowledge that the deregister has actually successfully taken place? And does anyone have an opinion on that?
Well, I sure have an opinion on that, which is that it's completely voluntary to get the rest of the blocks for a response. So if if the first response already gives you the code that tells you the server has understood the deregister, then you're done. You don't have to get the rest. I actually had a comment on a previous slide, on slide 12. I think it's really important to distinguish attacks where we thought that COIP is secure, and it turns out it isn't, in the presence of an attacker that do something specific, from additional ways in which an attacker that already can do a lot of things can do even more things. And I think this discussion about token manipulation really is something where we already have lost, because we have a rogue proxy, or we have no seg mode, so we didn't have security before this attack became known. So I don't think it's in the same class as the other attacks, like the reordering attack we talked about before. So I think it's very different, not piling up more ways to abuse an insecure situation, even in a different way. This is just confusing. We should tell people when they actually have to do something specific, because they thought they were secure, but an attacker can do something that is surprising, maybe for people who thought they were secure.
Sure, it's kind of, in one sense, alerting them that there can be, they haven't, or someone hasn't properly thought through the security model and what are the effects of a malicious actor doing stuff. But yeah, it's token manipulation. Someone can say, well, I've unlocked my car, but that's been manipulated to follow on with the locking of the car and then reversing them around. And you get this great potential there for creating real fun and games. But
the rogue proxy could also change the data to just say, yes, of course you have locked your car.
Yep.
And so that's nothing new.
No, but it's just the OS core end-to-end trust certainly mitigates a lot against that.
Sure, but again, that's independent of this specific attack, because a rogue proxy can always change your data.
Yes, true. Okay, just coming back to the cancellation, and you say we don't need to get the rest of it. There will be a cache key somewhere for that observe request, which has not been, because all the data hasn't been sent back. And so you may get a memory starvation attack taking place on the server. Unless there is some sort of timeouts or garbage collection of those cache keys for those pre-existing observe requests.
The server has to always expect that a client may not keep fetching the full rest of a resource.
True.
That's already very explicit in 7.959.
So there are two kinds of block 2 responses. One where the server sends a 2.31 back, which means this thing is still active. Mm-hmm. And one where it sends like a 205 or whatever the success response, the actual success response is. And if I get a 205 on my first block, then I would consider this request done.
Okay, and so just then the garbage collection just needs to leave it lying around a little bit on the server in case there's a request for block number 1 or block number 2 following. Yeah. That's fine. Okay, thank you for that. So to say thank you. Any other questions, thoughts?
I'd just like to pick up that point of having those 205 versus 231 responses to re-emphasize how I think we should we should consider fixing blockwise in this interaction case to just send the request payload again, because fetch could do all this 205 stateless server thing, but it can't because the request payload doesn't get repeated. So I think we're losing out a lot on what fetch can do because blockwise behaves that way. And I don't know what our upgrade path there is, but I think we should seriously consider that.
Okay, so if let's say the fetch request has 6 blocks to send upstream, and then we start getting block 2 responses, we're going to have to repeat sending those 6 requests every time. So there could be quite an overhead.
No. It would be fine if there is block 1. If there is block 1 splitting, and there is and the block 1 cannot be processed independently, as it can only be done when there is no actual response. Then yes, the server is stateful and it won't get around this. But many fetch requests will have the fetch payload fit in a single request payload,
right?
And the response not. And in those cases, repeating the fetch payload has the large upside that the server doesn't need to keep any state around. It can just process the request one more time, generate this other view of the response, rather than keeping the state around.
I concur with that. So if essentially if everything fits into a single block, that's fine. The challenge could be if it goes via a proxy who says, yep, I can accept 1024 on my left, but I can only do 64 bytes on my right. That's a bit of a problem.
That would still be fine, because the proxy accepts the request with 1024 and then keeps that state around to clock to send it on in those small chunks.
Right, but then when there's
the proxy needs to be aware of blockwise transfer. There's no way around that.
Sure.
Yeah, on this topic and more in general on the clarifications on the previous slide, is that all material intended also for co-op attacks or for somewhere like, again, core-clar?
I don't think it's specifically attacks, but it is.
Right.
It's because all the RFCs came out in a particular order, and blocks came after observe and fetch came somewhere in between. I think it's everything just gets in a mess as to what am I supposed to do under these particular edge case scenarios, and hence why I just put this down here, because Christian's confused. I think I was confused in early days, and I'm sure one or two other people are likely to be confused as well.
They can be selective updates to observe and blockwise.
We do have a corrections and clarifications document.
Yeah, that's one venue for sure. What do you think, Karsten? I think you are the main maintainer of that initiative.
Well, it's currently not a working group document, right? So if we want to give it some status at some point, then we would have to think about making it one.
Okay, for now, we shouldn't lose track of this slide in particular.
Yeah, so maybe just submit a PR.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so who's going to submit the PR? Because if I'm happy to do it, but I need to know what to do it against.
Well, I guess you weren't opening an issue. That's very easy.
Yeah, I think John's question is, where's the repo? And I'm just trying to find out whether I can find out, and then I might be able to give the answer.
It's almost like a co-op wiki somehow, somewhere.
Yeah, it's weird. It's not in Carsten's repositories. But it.
Find it.
There is one action item that I think I will have to take, that is to prepare a very short 9175 update.
So this should be in the core working group repository.
It's already in the notes. Maybe I failed to unmute myself.
Okay, so does everybody know where to put what?
Who's going to take the responsibility of doing that?
John, if you have the issues clear in mind, can you open an issue per bullet point?
Okay, I need to go and find it. So if someone just points me to where it is, I can
Oh,
create
sorry,
this.
it's in the notes.
Oh, it's in the notes. Okay,
right,
sorry.
Christian put the link on line 140.
Oh, sorry, my. Yeah, oops. Sorry, I missed that. All right, okay, I'll put something on there. Yep, no worries.
Yeah, I think it's
This kind of-
preferable one issue per bullet point because they're of course related, but still
Yeah,
well enough
done.
separated.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, I'll do that post this. No problem.
Thank you.
Okay, otherwise I think I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Christian, you had preliminary notes. In the notes, I guess you covered all of them. If not, please raise them. You are muted, just in case you're trying to say something.
Too many mute buttons. Yeah, all done. Already removed.
Okay, great. So I think we're done with that. Thanks, John, for the preparation. Appreciate it.
Yep, sorry I couldn't do it 2 weeks ago.
No problem at all. Thank you again. Okay, so next is Martine. Yes, over co-op.
I still need the slide.
Yeah, I think John has to release, or I can, and then give you permissions.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay. Then, I wanted to talk a little bit about DNS over co-op and our progress again. For those, in case someone doesn't know what I'm talking about, again, we want to encrypt name resolution for IoT devices against eavesdropping, and for that we want to use co-op, namely DNS over co-op, so we can use encrypted communication and the blockwise method, and also share system resources with the co-op application. Some good news is that we finally have a paper on this published at CONEX 2023, and there's also a preprint available on arXiv if you want to read into it already. How does our doc draft, there was a question by the chairs, relate to the DNS CBOR draft we also currently discuss in the CBOR working group? The draft about DNS over co-op just introduces an application DNS message format, which a content format, which is basically just mapping the media type from HTTP DNS over the HTTPS. So it's a classic DNS wire format and easily transferable to other DNS transports. However, if we work in the IoT, sometimes things are not small enough, even when we use the classic name compression that we have in the DNS wire format. So we decided to go for a CBOR-based format, which is application DNS plus CBOR, as discussed in the draft, which reduces the message size even more. And if that even isn't enough, there's optional support for packed CBOR, so that we can even have even smaller messages. But the idea is to still use application DNS message as a fallback, either if the client or server doesn't support the CBOR format, or what can also be the case if the CBOR format is, for whatever reason, actually larger than the DNS wire format. No? Okay. So what changed since we talked about the draft since IETF 116? We didn't publish a new draft yet, but there were some work happening on GitHub. We clarified that the DNS over co-op is orthogonal to DNS over HTTP, and in what way. We recommended that the root path should be the DNS resource path. We set an ID for the application DNS message content format, namely 353535. So no, 35353. So we have somewhat that remembers you about the DNS port. We rationalize why we do all the TTL rewriting we talk about in the draft, and we also added a section on implementation status. So if you want to read about our implementations, you can do so now. Carsten was asking what I meant with orthogonal. Orthogonal means it's just not like 100% compatible. Like you can't just map DNS over CoreUp to DNS over HTTPS. That's what I mean by that. So does this clarify your question? Okay. Then there are still some open discussions, namely on the mailing list in cooperation with DNS Ops, thanks to Ben Schwartz again there. Because there is still some discussion ongoing about SVCB DNS records, where we may need to allocate an ALPN ID for CoreUp over DTLS. There's also a GitHub issue on that. And the CoreUp ID, there's already a CoreUp ID for CoreUp over TLS, but it was never mandated for DTLS, and Ben also recommended to keep this for TLS only and have maybe a new ID for DTLS. And there is nothing on SVCBs for OSCORE or ad hoc. We started some discussion on the mailing list, but there's still some consensus on that needed. And even though they are, well, especially because they are orthogonal, there is some translation needed between DOC or DOH, maybe when we have a CoreUp to HTTP proxy. Or we just say, hey, this is just a DNS forwarder and it treats DNS over HTTP like any other DNS transport. But the main question here is to the core working group, how to translate fetch to HTTP in general. Maybe we answer this in the document, or maybe we do not. Marco?
Martina, have you checked the query method?
What do you mean by query method in this case?
I'm looking for the right document, but HTTP is defining a query method. That is
Basically, they're catching up.
The equivalent of... Okay, I didn't want to say that.
Okay, maybe I have a look into this. If someone can give me maybe a link or
I
something.
lost track of the exact status of that document, but for sure it
I'm
exists.
I'm just afraid it will not help with this issue, because even if we define that fetch should be translated into query in an update to the proxying document, then this will still not make DOH use query. So it's not helping here.
So I'm not aware about the query method. I know about search.
Now I understand what you mean by query method also. But Carsten, you first.
Yeah, so that has been stuck in the HTTP world since RFC 5323. And I'm not sure whether we can count this on ever getting unstuck.
I mean, and the other problem is, now that I know what we're actually talking about, is for DOH, there are very specific methods defined, get and post. So I don't think we can use the query or the search method. So there needs to be some decision or some definition on how to translate it if we want to go that route. So yeah.
I think given that the times are already, the TTLs are already not compatible, we can't go that route anyway, even if there were a defined way of translating a fetch. So I think then we should just state that like it's fetch, it can't be translated anyway, even if it were, so we're not translating it. A DOH server might have an easy time implementing DOC as well, but doing a DOC proxy, DOC can't be done just by making a reverse proxy to DOH.
Okay. then we just specify that, I guess. Okay, then the other thing that is still open is a GitHub issue, which, given the discussion in the previous talk, I'm not even sure if this is applicable anymore. So it's basically about when we use DOC in the unprotected case. So if for whatever reason we can't use crypto and but we want to have the feature set of doc like blockwise transfer, and currently the draft says that you should not use set the MID of DNS then to 0 to prevent response spoofing. Christian there said that we could maybe still use the caching advantages by setting MID to 0 if we rely on the co-op tokens. Carsten wanted to say something?
What is MID?
The message ID in the DNS header.
Ah, the DNS message ID, because we have a message ID in co-op. And
yeah.
I was
sorry. Yeah. Maybe I just copied the title of the issue and yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe a little bit more specific would have helped. Yes, I'm talking about the DNS message ID.
Thank you.
DNS header. So yeah, the question is if we still could maybe use MID 0 and instead rely on the co-op tokens, but a little bit from the talk before, I'm not sure if this helps or if we can rely on that.
I think we can rely on the token because everyone who can spoof the token can DNS is
true,
a bit DNS is a bit defensive in that they assume that hey, maybe you could want to defend against parties that are blindly injecting stuff, but co-op generally does not really try to work on that. Like, if you're worried about that, take a non-trivial token, but the message ID can still be 0. The MID in the DNS sense.
Okay, I guess then there's a message in the chat. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think regarding ESCO was noted that the DNS identifier is just used ID. I've seen both, to be honest. Yes, in the RFC it's just ID, but yeah. But I also saw, like in DNS literature, the term MID.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the clarification.
Okay, but in the document it will be clearer what message ID we are talking about. Yeah. So I guess we then go ahead and just keep MID to 0 and rely on the co-op tokens instead, and clarify this in the draft. So the question now remains: what do we need from the VG, from the working group to progress? And yeah, basically the things we discussed here already is the guidance on how to translate fetch to HTTPS. We don't do that. And also like a statement or some action item on the service B records about with ESCORE or co-op over DTLS. And of course, as always, more feedback is always appreciated. Anything, especially on the second point, would be interesting. ESCO?
Yep, checking if it works. So it's not on the second point, but some feedback was on the basically the content format number. You could actually just request 5.3 for that. So you have
yes. Oh, I didn't talk about this yet, but 5.3 in my mind would be the better content format for the CBOR format, because then we can benefit from the shorter ID. Carsten?
Yeah,
you could still use 353 for the application/DNS format.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
If the length is not so critical, then you can also use indeed 353 or 533 or something. 5353 maybe.
But 5353 is in a space that we try to keep available for an experiment that we haven't really gotten to yet.
Yeah, 5353 was my first pick too. But Carsten already reined me back there.
But yeah, in
Three
any
five
case,
three is maybe also a good idea. Yeah.
yeah, or at least something that is in the lower space. I think that's reserved for let's say IETF specifications, new specifications that make use of content format. And yeah, I would personally go for the single 5.3, but if you say you want to use that for something else in the future, then yeah, okay, that's also fine. You can also go for 5.4, huh? That just +1.
I guess I then go for 353. Any more feedback?
And why not 5.4 then? Because there's plenty of bytes still there, I would say.
Well, I don't agree.
You don't agree, okay.
And also, I want to keep it mnemonic with the DNS numbers, and I think 5.4 is a little bit more confusing in that case.
Yeah, then okay, something like 5.3.3 then could be, for example, used there.
Yeah.
Also,
Like
or
something with 3s and 5s.
Yeah.
I will make a decision in the draft then.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. That's fine. Thanks.
Okay. So if there's no more feedback, I go ahead with the next steps. Yeah, I try to address the feedback, of course, and before the draft cut off, we will publish the version 3 of the draft. And if you again have any more input on that, of course, it's always welcome.
Thank you. Esko, you still have your hand raised. You want to say something? I guess no. Okay. No more comments in the chat either. So I guess that's it. Looking forward to the next version.
Yeah.
Thanks, Martina.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So we have about 15 minutes or so left for non-traditional responses. And Christian, I guess you caught up from the latest interim and the short discussion we had there from the minutes, but you have prepared something here now.
Yes, I hope I got everything on the last items minutes. So basically what I would like to achieve today is to get a rough feeling of the working group of whether this is a direction the working group is willing to support. Background is this document is an individual document by Carsten, whom I've joined as an author in the -1 version. And the original direction of the document was that it would just define a few options for things like triangular responses and responses that are pre-configured but say what they are the response for. In -1, this is being generalized to not only describe such options, but to define what to flesh out the general concept behind them, which is not only used in those options, but has been in use since the start of co-op. For example, in observations or in responses to multicast requests, but all is seeing an increase in such options now in, for example, with multicast proxies, or also in the Q-block options, which also solicit multiple responses. Now, what I think we should do here is, and -01 goes some part of the way already, is one, define that general concept. And I think the very short version is every response that is not a single response to a single request is that is not that one response, or if there is not just such one response, that is a quote non-traditional response. And two, then go on defining how, or describing how one defines such options and what general guidance is processing those options, because we're seeing a lot of them, and authors of each single of them will be tempted to reiterate on the same things, such as we're responding on the same token, we are not interfering with flow control, or we are interfering with flow control, but I think the general case is we are not interfering with flow control. General co-op flow control still applies, and give a set of such rules that can then be referenced when a new option is introduced. And I think this is both helpful in keeping the specifications clean and in keeping the implementations clean, because the implementations can then say, we have a request, we have a mechanism of doing a request with several responses, and this is the general API. And then if you're doing an observation, or if you're doing a block request that has multiple block responses, then this all is happening through the same mechanisms, and there is not one mechanism and another tacked on top of each other, and worse yet, that they would need to interoperate, because the general rules that are set out here would allow multiple such options to just cooperate. The intention is not to redefine observation and multicast and response to multicast requests here, because that would be updating a whole lot of documents, and would mean generally these things already do work. There is an appendix that describes them in that way, but this is purely informative. And if it so happens that at a later point in time, one of those documents does a BIS, it might be perfectly feasible to use the new terminology, but that's not the plan here. So is that extension to co-op something that the working group could get behind?
Yeah, there's a +1 obviously in the chat from Karsten. Yeah, again, as an individual, I restate this is useful, and it's more to clarify what happened is happening anyway, just in multiple documents that can be otherwise difficult to track. So I support this. Richard also.
One aspect of the question, especially seeing, for example, John in the room, is also, would this help you implementing those things in the implementations that you have written or are writing?
Can you say that again?
Is this something that you think would help you implementing, would help along implementations of co-op? That could you make use of this in implementations?
That really is down to the people who are doing the implementations. I'm kind of providing more of the kind of library support in there. Yeah, one of my challenges is that I'm supposed to have retired about 2 years ago and haven't yet. And so I'm supposed to be winding things down, but there's having a structure in terms of what's there in the responses does make sense to me, because then you can key off that a lot easier in terms of what you're doing. Just as one needs to agree what's sitting in there, or it's making proper sense, etc.
Thanks.
And Christian, before you were using often the word option, and I wonder if you were referring to option as alternative incarnations of the concept or co-op options, probably both, because the document is actually defining also co-op options.
So I think I'll have to take a step back here. I think, and it's also in the document, that every request that solicits non-traditional responses will need to indicate that somehow, because essentially it will be keeping that token open in some way. In many cases, this is happening through options, but it can also happen through components of the header or other context things. So, for example, requests, looking at requests multicast addresses through the lens of non-traditional responses, there it is the destination address of the request that is keying everyone to the fact that the token will be used with multiple responses. When a message is set up through as a phantom request for multicast notifications, that is also a key that there's something going on. But it doesn't need to be in a co-op option.
Okay. But thinking of co-op options, you mentioned in the previous discussion, and I tried to quote you at the latest interim meeting, a possible further co-op option that you had in mind as an even more general alternative that can be used to the current option defined in GroupCon proxy for that sort of opening, just not giving a time indication, but rather acting as a on and off switch. It was something like that.
Yeah, I think it will make sense to have one or a small set of relatively general setup options, because those would need to be proxy unsafe, whereas then whatever describes the characteristics of responses could be safe to forward. So, for example, if we were to introduce a mechanism to the classical blockwise responses that allows the server to respond with multiple block 2 options, block 2 messages, then we could have a proxy unsafe option that says, and by the way, you may send me the next 10 blocks. But then that option would be only for this purpose, whereas if we had a more general option that says, and by the way, you may send 10 blocks, and maybe some additional option says, and by the way, and please do really use that to send blocks. So the critical the proxy unsafe option is keeping the token open for some time or some number of messages or until some condition is met. And then other options would not be under the pressure of being proxy unsafe. This is especially important when looking at what options are inner and outer in the OSCORE sense, because the please keep the gates open option needs to be outer, because the proxy that is not participating in OSCORE needs to be aware that there are multiple things coming in. But we don't necessarily want to tell that proxy what it is we're doing. Are we doing multicast here? Are we sending, doing a large block transfer? In a block transfer, that's not supposed to be visible to the proxy. So having a general purpose option would make sense. Whether we should have one or three of them, like one for eventual consistency, which is already observed, one for open until further notice, and one for open for this and that many messages, I can't tell.
Yeah, or at least you want to say that proxy as least as possible. For example, not tell for how long whatever is going on is going to go on. You imagine the use case of that kind, by the way, a few weeks ago. That we also tried to capture in the minutes 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Okay, is still the same document, of course, but you are clearly targeting a revision of its scope, of course. Do you plan, a revision incorporating that new scope basically in the next few days for the cutoff,
So I have a list of about five documents, one down, 4 to go, open, and I don't know if I will manage to update something here. And frankly, this is, so I think what should go into the next update of this is a bit of implementation experience. I do have basically 2 co-op implementations where I'm considering pivoting the implementation of observation, etc., onto that track. Hearing that there was positive feedback out of the working group, I think a good next step for me would be to also gather that implementation experience and then feed that back into a next iteration. So not planning to present on 117, and I don't think I will have an update in time for the cutoff. Carsten?
Yeah, I think this might be a document where submitting it on the Sunday of the IETF also would work.
And in addition, that comes in the AOB section. We were considering having this as one of the main topics for the side meeting.
Yes.
Booked for the Friday of the IETF week. Wherever we are with this topic, I mean, it can be, again, an open discussion like this with more time available, or concrete discussion on a submitted draft.
Yeah, I think it will be easier to do the Friday meeting if we have a document that already has some updates in it.
Totally. But thanks for the work you're putting on that already, Christian and Karsten.
All right, then I'll try to do an update in time for after the cutoff. Thanks for organizing this.
Sounds great. Any more input or comments on non-traditional responses? Okay, if none, we are the AOB, and we quickly touched on most of this, actually. So we are meeting in 20 days from today on Tuesday 25 for a 2-hour session in the morning of San Francisco, late afternoon in Central European time zone. And then we have already booked a time slot and a physical room for a side meeting of CORE. That's the last day of the IETF meeting, all considering the main meeting agenda and room availability and so on. But we reserved everything for, the same time slot, basically, the morning of San Francisco and the late afternoon in Europe. We have a link to Meetecho available to use. At least it was created. Hopefully it works fine. Otherwise, we'll use within Jitsi as a fallback. And the idea was to mainly discuss non-traditional responses there. I think we'll have something to discuss of some kind, but any other topic that can fit also following the core session can be considered. And finally, we were thinking very ahead of the next series of core interim meetings, post IETF 117. And we have a very, very tentative calendar, just keeping the same cadence as now on the odd weeks, same day, same time. It's just something, first of all, to confirm with the chairs of CBOR to be sure we keep interleaving. I don't know, Christian, if you can at least confirm the intention to keep the same cadence in CBOR. Otherwise, we'll check better also in the mail with Barry.
Yes, the intention is to stay within the cadence we have had.
Okay, we'll open a thread with you and Barry then. If Barry also agrees, then we'll raise this at IETF 117, further confirm on the list, and there's no big problem. We go for it. there's one particular planned day where Karsten and I are not available, but as long as Jaime is available, it should be possible to have the meeting anyway. Okay. Anything else you want to mention last minute? If none, thanks for the great work. See you at IETF 117.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Richard and Christian, for the minutes. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.